I met Charlie Chaplin on a Tuesday evening in October of 1952 in a hotel suite that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. He had not invited me. I had not asked to come. Someone, I no longer remember who, had simply suggested that I might want to speak with him before he left. I remember thinking as I waited in that dim sitting room that the silence was unusual. Not uncomfortable exactly, just the kind of silence that exists in rooms where important decisions have already been made and all that remains is the paperwork. When he entered, he was smaller than I expected, not in stature. I knew he was a small man, but in presence. He moved carefully as though he had learned not to take up too much space. His handshake was brief. His smile was polite. He gestured toward a chair, and I sat. We spoke about nothing for several minutes. The weather, the hotel, whether I took cream in my coffee. He was courteous in that old-world manner that makes Americans feel slightly provincial. And beneath it all, I sensed something I could not yet name, a kind of preparedness, as though he had been rehearsing this particular performance for months. He did not seem angry. That was what struck me most. I had expected anger or bitterness or defiance. Instead, there was only a watchful calm, the kind you see in men who have already lost and are simply waiting for the rest of the world to notice. I asked him carefully, because I was young and unsure of the etiquette, whether he was looking forward to the trip abroad. He was scheduled to leave for London in a few weeks for the premiere of his new picture. A simple promotional tour, the studio had said, nothing unusual. He looked at me for a moment and I realized he was deciding something. "Mr. Cronkite," he said quietly, "I suspect I will enjoy London very much." There was something in the way he said it, not the words themselves, but the weight behind them, as though he were speaking about a place much farther away than England. I didn't press. I was a reporter, yes, but I was also a guest in his room, and there are some questions that cannot be asked directly. So instead, we talked about other things, about film, about comedy, about the difficulty of making people laugh when the world insists on being serious. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses his steps on ice. At one point, he paused mid-sentence and looked toward the window, where the rain had begun to streak the glass. "You know," he said, "there was a time when I believed that laughter could protect you, that if you made enough people happy, they would remember it when things became difficult." He smiled then, but it was not a happy smile. I was wrong about that. It would be several years before I fully understood what had happened to Charlie Chaplin. Not what he was accused of. Those rumors had been circulating for some time, but what had been done to him and how carefully it had been done. There were no charges. That was the remarkable thing. No trial, no formal accusation, no single moment when the machinery of the state rose up and said, "You are not welcome here." Instead, there was pressure, quiet, persistent, unyielding pressure, the kind that comes not from laws but from whispers, not from courts but from columnists, not from the government directly but from the atmosphere the government had helped to create. Chaplin was not arrested. He was simply discouraged. His politics had always been suspect, of course. He had never hidden his sympathies for the poor, the displaced, the forgotten. His films had mocked authority, celebrated the underdog, suggested that perhaps the system itself was the problem. In the 1930s, this had seemed charming. In the 1950s, it seemed dangerous. He had been called before committees, asked questions, invited to clarify his position. He had refused to cooperate in the manner expected, and this refusal had been noted, not as a crime exactly, just as a choice that would have consequences. The consequences were never spelled out. They didn't need to be. Financiers became nervous. Distributors grew cautious. Theaters wondered aloud whether his pictures were worth the trouble. The FBI kept files. The press kept asking questions. And slowly, carefully, the country that had made him rich and famous began to make it clear that his presence was no longer required. This is what I came to understand years later, sitting in my office and thinking back on that quiet evening. America had learned how to exile someone without admitting it. We spoke for nearly 2 hours that night. He told me stories, small ones, the kind that reveal character without demanding sympathy, about growing up poor in London, about vaudeville stages and silent film sets, about the strange alchemy of making people laugh. He spoke about comedy as though it were a form of truth-telling, the only kind, he suggested, that people would tolerate. When you make them laugh, he said, they lower their guard, just for a moment. And in that moment, you can show them something they might not otherwise see. I asked him what he meant. He considered this. "I mean," he said, "that tragedy tells people what they already believe about the world. But comedy has to sneak the truth in sideways." He paused, then added, "And that, I think, is why they never quite trust it." I did not ask him who they were. I didn't need to. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when the conversation shifted. We had been discussing his early films, the ones that made him famous, and he had grown animated, almost cheerful. Then, without warning, he stopped. "You know," he said, "the thing no one tells you about success is that it makes you visible. And visibility, Mr. Cronkite, is not always a blessing." He looked at me directly then, and I saw something in his face I had not seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of exhausted clarity. "When you are loved by everyone," he said, "you are trusted by no one." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. He smiled, that same sad, careful smile, and continued. "The moment you become a symbol, you stop being a person. And symbols, I'm afraid, are always political, even when they don't mean to be." He stood then and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. "I wanted to make people happy," he said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted. But happiness, it seems, is a complicated thing to give people. They want it, certainly, but they also resent you for it. Because to make them laugh, you have to show them something about themselves, and not everyone wants to see. The machinery of McCarthy-era America was efficient in its cruelty. It did not need to prove guilt. It only needed to suggest doubt. And doubt, once planted, grew quickly. Chaplin's crime, if it could be called that, was not his politics exactly. It was his independence, his refusal to declare loyalty in the manner demanded, his insistence that art should be free to observe, to question, to unsettle. In another time, this might have been forgiven. But in the early 1950s, with the Cold War hardening and fear spreading like frost, there was no room for ambiguity. You were with us or you were suspect. And Chaplin, who had spent his career in the space between laughter and tears, between sympathy and critique, could not make himself fit into such narrow categories. So he was squeezed out, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, like water from a sponge. By the time he left for London in September of 1952, everyone knew he would not be coming back, though no one said it directly. The press speculated. The government issued vague statements, and Chaplin himself said only that he was taking a trip. But we all understood. I saw him once more before he boarded the ship, briefly at a small gathering. He was gracious, as always, shook hands, smiled at the right moments. But I noticed that he said goodbye to no one. It was as though he had already left. Years later, after McCarthy had fallen and the fever had broken, people would ask why Chaplin never returned. The government eventually made it clear he would be allowed back under certain conditions. An apology, perhaps, an explanation, some gesture of contrition. He refused. Not angrily, not dramatically. He simply declined. I think I understand why now, though I did not then. To return would have been to accept the premise that he had done something wrong, that he owed America an explanation for his thoughts, his sympathies, his art, that exile was a punishment he had earned, and forgiveness was something he needed to request. Chaplin understood something that the rest of us took longer to learn, that exile doesn't require borders. It only requires the understanding that you are no longer wanted, and once that understanding settles in, no official pardon can undo it. He lived the rest of his life in Switzerland, made a few more films, received honors, grew old. In 1972, he returned to America once, briefly, to accept an honorary Academy Award. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted 12 minutes. He smiled, he waved, he said a few gracious words, and then he left. For good. I think about that evening often. The rain on the window, the careful way he chose his words, the sadness beneath the politeness. I think about how America punished him without admitting it, how we exiled him without signing the papers, how we let him go not because we thought he was guilty, but because it was easier than defending him. And I think about what he said that night, the thing I didn't fully understand until much later. When they stop trusting you, Mr. Cronkite, it doesn't matter what you say. The silence becomes permanent. Not because they won't listen, but because you learn to stop speaking. History did not accuse Charlie Chaplin. It simply let him go. And that is the way it was.